So the concept of elasticity isn't just limited to demand and price and the relationship between those two things. Those are very important, the price elasticity of demand and the cross elasticity. But it's a very versatile tool. It really is thinking about the relationship between almost any two quantitative variables. And so we can look at other types of relationships and use elasticity to help us understand what's happening in the market and the impacts on sort of variables of interest. So let's look at a few examples. First, one really common elasticity that you'll find in textbooks is the income elasticity of demand. Well, can you guess what that is? Thankfully, economists are not very creative, except for in the case of the income effect. And so as we look at the income elasticity of demand, we're asking the question, as we change a person's income, how big will that change in the quantity demanded be? So let's look at what that would be if we modeled it using the tools that we've developed. So when we think about the demand curve, right, we have quantity and price in the demand curve. Now, what happens as a consumer receives additional income? Well, if this is, say, something like pizza, and consumers now have more income available, we're going to expect that this demand curve should shift to the right. And so that increase in income assumes that price is constant. And again, we're describing these 2 points on two different demand curves. And so that change in income, right, has an impact by causing the demand curve to shift. And in this case, as income rises, demand will shift right. Right? And so this is what we're looking at. Here, what's causing this change to happen is a change in income, and it's specifically increasing. Right? So as that increases, it pushes the demand curve over. Now, this is very similar to all of the other elasticities that we've looked at this point, where we have the percentage change in quantity in the numerator. The difference is that in the denominator, this is the change in income that's causing the change in quantity to arise. Now, for most products, what would you expect this relationship to look like? Well, as we get an increase in income, that should cause the quantity demanded, right? The demand will shift to the right, the quantity demanded will also increase. If we thought about income decreasing, right, sort of something happened and the amount of money a person has available is declined, well, that's going to be the opposite impact, right? That's going to cause the demand curve to now shift left, and that quantity demanded decreases. So this is also negative. You notice in both of these cases, a positive divided by a positive and a negative divided by a negative, both of these give us a positive result. So for most products, the income elasticity of demand should be positive. Well, what would it mean if this result here was actually negative? Well, that would mean these two pieces are moving in opposite directions. And so as a consumer's income rises, they're actually consuming less. And as their income is declining, they're going to consume more. So what would cause something like that to happen in the marketplace? Well, as we look at this, as your income's rising and you're actually consuming less, we have to ask what's happening here. Well, you have more income, that means you can buy more goods and services, assuming that prices are constant. And so what are those things that you would buy less of? That's what we call an inferior good. And the concept here is very basic. All we're saying is that for an inferior good, that the consumer, as they get more income, they buy some other good that's they consider better. Right? So what would an inferior good look like? Well, maybe that's for college students who tend to eat a lot of ramen noodles. Right? Maybe if they get extra income, they go out and buy something a little bit more expensive. Or for some people, maybe this is buying clothing at a secondhand store, that if they get more income, they go out and buy new clothing, or used cars compared to new cars. Right? The idea here is that there's a product in the marketplace that a consumer considers inferior. And the only reason that they're buying that inferior version of the product is that they don't have enough income to afford the product that they consider to be better. So that's one example of how we see the elasticity can be used to understand a concept that's not necessarily the relationship of price and quantity demanded. Another way that we can see this is using the elasticity of supply, where up to this point, everything we've looked at has been focused on demand. And of course, that makes sense. This is a class on consumer demand. But you'll often see elasticities used to describe supply. So whether that's a price change causes producers to produce more, right? One big question is going to be, well, how big is that increase in supply? Right? So if we were going to tax producers or provide a subsidy to producers, then how big would that change in the quantity supplied be? We could also look at cross-elasticities in the context of supply as well. Right? So if the price of a basketball rises, how will that impact the producer's decision to produce, say, a soccer ball or a football? And so there's a relationship between products, and the elasticity of supply describes that just from the producer's perspective. Now, the last example that I'd like to talk about is something that really doesn't include the demand or the price, and it's to look at, say, the idea of housing prices. So imagine population in a particular area is changing. Well, how will that changing population impact the price of a house? So let's take a look at what that model would look like. We need to consider the housing market. So here that we have the quantity of housing and we have the price of housing. And we have a demand curve. And so now imagine that the population, right? So there's a change in population. Maybe the population in an area is increasing. Well, what would we expect to happen in the housing market? Well, that's going to cause the demand curve to shift right. There's more people, so we would expect at any given price that's going to have an impact sort of in the market. But what about a change in population where the population is decreasing? Well, that's going to have the opposite impact. Right? There's going to be fewer people demanding housing at any given level. Now, next time, what we'll end up looking at is what does a supply curve look like here? And one thing to consider is that there's a supply curve describing the market here. And so the change in demand that's resulting from a change in population helps us measure how big is this shift. Is it a shift to the left? Is it a shift to the right? And the magnitude of this. And in an elasticity sense, we could say that here the housing price elasticity, right? There's really no good abbreviation for this, but we could look at this and say, well, this thing then is really the change, the percentage change in the housing price, all divided by the percentage change in population. So again, in elasticity, it's a really broad topic for us, and we can talk about a relationship between any two variables. Now, why is this important, right? Why would we want to be able to look at the impact of population on housing? There's a really great study by two doctors, Glazer and Jericho, and what they found is that in areas that are growing, that the elasticity here is 0.23. And in areas where the population's declining, the elasticity is 1.8. Well, what would that tell us? Remember that this is the change in the housing price divided by the change in the population. So this says as population's growing, right, housing prices appreciate, they get larger, but they get larger at basically a 1% change in population is a 0.23% increase in the housing price. But look at this when population's declining, and so there's a problem, especially in some urban areas where we see urban decline, that here that 1% change in population is actually a 1.8% decrease in the housing price. it's a much bigger impact in those declining areas. And so something like this can really help us to understand the dynamics of a market and also give us some way to analyze what's happening and think about then possible ways to adjust for that.